Alrighty. Hello, everyone. Good afternoon, good evening, good late morning, depending on what time zone you're in. My name is Erin Aoyama. I am the Programs and Research Fellow at Minidoka National Historic Site for this summer, and I'm one of the members of the planning committee of Tadaima, a community virtual pilgrimage. So welcome to this session where we will be talking about the legacy of Minoru Yasui. So before we get going and before I have our wonderful panelists introduce themselves, I just want to take a moment sort of modeling off of what our book club has been doing through the Minidoka Pilgrimage Planning Committee and some conversations we've been having to acknowledge the land that we're on, because as you know, one of the main purposes of Tadaima and this pilgrimage itself is to think about histories and bring to light histories and share stories that are often covered over and erased. So along that same line, I just want to acknowledge that we are all situated on occupied Indigenous land. The four of us are in different places, so I'll speak only for myself here. I live in Providence, Rhode Island, so I am on the traditional homelands of the Narragansett and Wampanoag peoples. The ongoing legacies of settler colonialism shape every aspect of American history, and that also includes the incarceration of Japanese Americans during World War II. So this is something that we're thinking about within our community, within scholarship, and it's also something I'd like to point to a panel that's happening in exactly 2 weeks on Saturday, July 11th at 2 p.m. Pacific time. That is called Japanese American Incarceration on Indigenous Land. So this is a panel presented by Japanese American Memorial Pilgrimages, JAMP, in partnership with Densho. It will feature Indigenous scholars, public historians, talking about what it means to talk about this history, think about this history situated on Indigenous land. So I just wanted to flag that for everyone. And finally, I also wanted to acknowledge the protests and actions taking place right now, calling for abolition and for justice, led by the movement for Black Lives. We're about to spend the next hour talking about the legacy of Min Yasui, someone who spoke up and fought for what was right throughout his life. So I hope that we'll also leave this panel, I know we will, leave this panel feeling inspired and having a sense of action steps that we can take to continue Min's legacy of speaking up and fighting for more just communities. So thank you so much for letting me speak a little bit in the beginning, and I'd like to pass it off to our three panelists and ask you all to introduce yourselves.
I think, first of all, Holly and June, I think you have to unmute yourself. So I'll just start.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'm Peggy Nagae. I was honored to be the lead attorney for Min Yasui. I'm in Portland, Oregon, and Holly and I started together Min Yasui Legacy Project, which then helped us get a Presidential Medal of Freedom for Min in 2015 with President Barack Obama, and then a permanent Minoru Yasui Day in Oregon. So a little bit about myself.
Let me go on then. I'm June Schumann. I got involved in the Min Yasui project when Peggy contacted me to help work on the medal campaign back in 2014, I think. And I functioned as the project coordinator. We were very successful, and so I have continued being a community volunteer on the Min Yasui project to explore what would be an appropriate follow-up to the awarding of the Presidential Medal of Freedom for Min Yasui.
Okay, I'm Holly Yasui. I like your introduction, Erin, so I'd like to note that I'm in San Miguel de Allende, Mexico. This is the Hopi in Chichimeca land. My pronouns are she and her, and I am the daughter of Min Yasui and the director of the film. As Peggy mentioned, she and I initiated the Min Yasui Tribute Project, is what we called it at the beginning, because it was to culminate with the 100th anniversary of the birth of Min Yasui in 2016. But thanks to Peggy and June, the project is continuing. It's now a legacy project, and we hope it will continue forever.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for introducing yourselves. I'd like to remind our audiences, please put any questions you might have or things you'd like for us to discuss in the chat on YouTube, and we'll see those and respond to those questions. I think since we're thinking about the film, in addition to thinking about Min's legacy, Holly, maybe you could start by talking about why it was important for you to make this film and what that process was like. What kinds of challenges were there in telling a story that's, you know, so close to your own life and about your own family? What kind of research did you do? Just why did you do this?
Oh, I actually prepared a little statement, so can I go ahead and read that first?
Yeah.
Then I will try to answer your question. Kind of based on what June had suggested, but I will answer your question. The film is structured in 3 parts. I hope everybody has seen it. Is that a correct assumption that everybody has watched the film? Everybody who's in this chat has seen the film? Well, I'll assume that you have.
Yeah.
Okay, the film is structured into 3 parts, much like the lives of the Issei and the Nisei, pre-war and post-war, with World War II as the dark divide that so deeply impacted each person, each family, and our whole community. My starting point in making the film was a trove of family photos saved for nearly a century by my auntie Yuka, whom you know from the film if you've seen it. I'm grateful that I was able to interview and preserve her stories, those of my Uncle Homer. They're the only 2 survivors of the Nisei generation of our family today. Much of the narration of the film about the war years came from my dad's speeches and interviews in the 1980s, when he traveled all over the country on behalf of redress. He was an exceptional orator and a passionate speaker with his encyclopedic knowledge of historical facts and personal experiences. I'm also deeply grateful to Peggy, who carries on that tradition. Her interviews bridge the divide between the wartime and post-war work of Min Yasui and beyond. I hope that my film has conveyed his unique place in history as the first person to purposely challenge the racist regulations imposed upon all persons of Japanese ancestry during the war. Trained as an attorney, his action was grounded by a thorough understanding of and belief in the principles of democracy and justice embodied in the U.S. Constitution. He lost his case at the U.S. Supreme Court. It was also important to me to show how he continued to fight for and defend the civil rights of all people all his life. He was an exemplary citizen who not only rose to the occasion, but also worked day in and day out for the betterment of his community and country. He worked on behalf of all people of color in the pre-civil rights the pre-civil rights era, is in the 40s and 50s, as well as during that tumultuous time in the 60s and 70s, advocating and advancing cross-cultural solidarity before it was known as such. I was also fortunate to be able to interview several people who worked for my dad. June Burke, who as a teenager was one of the first of many young people that he mentored, and members of his staff at the Denver Commission on Community Relations, Linda Tolliver and Betty Salazar. It was particularly moving to me to discover how Betty has passed on the commitment to community activism to her children and grandchildren. They're an amazing and inspiring Latino family that carries on the legacy of Min Yasui in Denver. Linda Vasquez with the Min Yasui Community Volunteer Award, and Chad Jimenez with the Min Yasui Inn of Court. The last scene of the film contains a message I hope the audience will leave with. Min Yasui saying, when you suppress or oppress any group of people, you are really derogating the rights of all people. If there's suffering or pain unfairly imposed upon anyone, it's my duty, it's your duty to try to alleviate it, because that's the way we gain a better life for all of us. I think that sentiment informs today's Nikkei activism, which Peggy and June will speak more about today. So I'll just mention one group, Voodoo for Solidarity. Against the zero-tolerance policy that resulted in the incarceration of thousands of immigrants, Nikkei activists created the Voodoo for Solidarity movement, calling for closing of the camps. We raise our voices in defense of Latinos, Africans, and Asians imprisoned in ICE facilities in order to be the allies that our families needed but did not have when they were imprisoned in WRA facilities. Stanshi Kuma, a leader in Voodoo for Solidarity and a longtime Tule Lake organizer, will make a presentation later in this pilgrimage I hope you'll attend. Dudu has joined the thousands of people supporting Black Lives Matter in the wake of the murder of George Floyd, because injustice anywhere threatens justice everywhere, as proclaimed in the last photo of my film of the Standing Rock protest. I hope that Never Give Up can serve not only as an educational experience for those who don't know the history of the Nikkei concentration camps, as I believe all of you do, but also as an inspiration for our community moving ahead to build a better world for all of us. Okay, so what was your question again? Would you like me to, I think I might have addressed what you asked about initiating the film, the structure and the persons I decided to interview and the purpose, basically.
Yeah, I'm wondering if you can, and thank you for sharing that. It's wonderful. I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about what it was like to tell this story about your family. That you're in, obviously, in that you've written the film and you're shaping, and the stories and the photos come from your family. But what was it, to try and tell basically a bunch of strangers who are going to watch this film like such a deeply personal story? Just what was that process like for you?
It was cathartic in many ways because since my dad died, I really did want to somehow preserve the fact that he was a really exceptional orator and speaker.
Right.
But I was working 2 jobs, etc. I moved to Mexico, worked 3 jobs, etc. And so it really wasn't until I retired that I was able to take on this project. It is something, as I say, that I've wanted to do for a long time. I did write a play in my spare time in the 90s while I was in Seattle. But making a film is really extraordinarily, incredibly time-consuming and all engaging.
Mm-hmm.
So it was not something I could do until after I had retired from my job here in Mexico. The process was very interesting in many ways. My father did not really belong to me or to my family. He belonged to the whole community. And so it was always like his story was in some ways just giving it back to the community that he always worked for. And so it was in some ways easy for me to detach because he was such a outgoing public person that whenever I accompanied him to events, which was fairly often, where he would make speeches and pound on tables and that sort of thing. It was always interesting that I could, that to me that was of course my dad, but it was also this person who was a public figure and in many ways my hero too.
Yeah.
So that part was not. It was not as difficult as it might have been had he been a different person, and had I been a different person. I also had a wonderful, wonderful co-director, Will Doolittle, who really helped me to get perspective on things. He's non-Nikkei, but married to a Japanese American, but he also helped me a great deal. Actually put some emotion back into the story because the tendency to want to just relate all the facts. But it is a family story.
Right.
The Never Give Up is a story about my aunt and uncle and my grandparents, and not so much about my sisters and I, but it is a family story too. So Will really helped me with that too.
Yeah. And I'm sure we'll have more questions, but one of the things I really loved about the film was how much Min's voice is in it. Like both literally all of the, recordings and all, but just you get such a sense of him as a person. So you did a really wonderful job telling his story and giving him back.
Well, thank you, because I wanted him to tell his own story. He would have told the whole thing without any narration if I'd only collected that footage in the 1980s and 90s while it was still existent. I do want to mention that. I mean, it's incredible. I was able to get the footage I got because some people actually saved footage that they had filmed for 30 years. I mean, that's how much impact he had on people. But of course, a lot of the footage is it's been 30 years, and so it just has not been preserved. It was also at that time, a lot of it was on video on magnetic tape. So.
Wow. Well, Peggy, if you have something prepared, also, we'd love to hear. I know we talked a little bit before about what we would talk about, but I think something you said in the film that stuck with me so much when you were talking about towards the end means legacy, and you talked about the quality of the struggle as what makes us humane and brings out the best of us. That it's not so much that you win or that you're get the outcome you want right away, but that it's how you do it and how you kind of fight for what's right. And I just thought that was really a beautiful way of thinking about his legacy. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about what it was like to work with Min, who he was like as a person and your relationship with him, and maybe how you got to working on his case and your own sort of path to, I'm sure that's quite a too.
Thanks, Erin. And I just want to add on to what Holly said. Holly did the film out of love, a lot of love, because she wasn't necessarily a natural filmmaker, although she went to film school. So it really was a labor of love and has been and continues to be. And my way of getting into the cases had to do with going to law school and reading about Korematsu, especially in my third year of law school, and just disliking it so much and thinking if there was anything I could do to write those cases, it would make these 3 years of torture called law school worthwhile. But what could you do? I mean, it had already gone to the U.S. Supreme Court. What are you going to do? Go to the court of God or something like that? And so it was so surprising that 5 years after I graduated, that I had this other opportunity. I got a call from Min. I'd met him a while before, like 3 years before, when we organized the second day of remembrance in the country in Portland, and he was the keynote speaker. And when I heard him speak, it was like, wow, who is this person? Booming voice, great oratory style. I'd worked with his brother Homer on the redress committee in Portland, but Min was so different and so bombastic in the way that he spoke. It was just a thrill, because having a Japanese American hero was not necessarily something that we all grew up with. And so seeing him, anyway, he called me, he said, if there's an opportunity, there might be an opportunity to reopen my World War II case. Are you interested? And he said, could you put together a group of lawyers? And I said, yes. And after that meeting, which it was a strange meeting, I wasn't sure if people were interested. I just said to him, I don't care if anyone else is interested. I'm interested. This is the case of our generation and our community. So whatever I can do, I would be honored to do. And that's kind of how I became his lead attorney. And what was so interesting about that is, he was a Nisei, so he's my parents' generation, and I'm a Sansei, like Holly's generation. I'm going, oh boy, and he's a lawyer, and I'm a female, and all those things going on at the same time. But he was really an exemplary client. He just was very attuned and willing to do whatever it was needed to win his case. So you never know what's going to happen. I had no clue that 5 years out of law school, I would have this opportunity, like the opportunity of a lifetime. And little did I realize back then in whenever that was, 1982, that it would be going on still today, that one form or another of what we did then would be happening today. So that was a little bit, and then I don't know if you asked me another question, but that's why that's how I feel right now.
Yeah, we'll come back. We'll come back. More questions. June, I want to ask you a little bit if you could talk about the Min Yasui Legacy Project and the work that you do and have been doing. If I think you are muted, but there we go.
Okay. Well, everybody in Portland knew Peggy. So when she called me and asked to have coffee to chat, so I said, of course I will. And so we met and we spent maybe an hour at the coffee shop chatting and what she had in mind after her conversation with Holly about getting a group of community leaders together to submit a nomination for Presidential Medal of Freedom for Min Yasui. Afterwards, I learned that that was my job application interview. And I got hired by Peggy to be the sort of the administrative end of the project. There were plenty of energy and ideas from Holly and Peggy and others about uh, who knew Min personally. I did not know him personally. I had seen him in public events and had read about him in newspapers and so on, but personally, I did not know him. So I sort of came as a community activist. I had been the founding director for Oregon Nikkei Legacy Center, now known as JAMO. I had worked in the community for a variety of civil rights cases dating back to my years in Philadelphia when Black Power movement was at its height. And so when Peggy came up with this idea, I was all ready to go. And we worked feverishly for about, 15 months or so of getting the strategy together, figuring out who ought to be on the committee, and who are the key people nationally, state level, regional, who are the Nikkei leaders we needed to be involved, who are African American leaders, who are Latino and Native American leaders, who ought to be contacted to support this effort. So it became a very large, broad-based national effort. So it was a lot of work. But and it was such a thrill to see the presentation of the medal at the White House. I did not get to go to it myself, but I got to see it on live telecast feed. And what I did was to watch the fruits of our labor and a very prominent recognition for a man who had done so much for the Nikkei community and rest of the communities of colors as well. So that was a thrill. Afterwards, we thought, with all this recognition from the President Obama and all of the contacts that we made in the process of it, and so many issues still remain needing attention locally and at the national level. We couldn't just let our effort end with a medal. And so that was sort of the beginning of thinking about what would be a proper way to follow through and continue the work that we worked so hard to tell about for the medal, but that are there ways for people who are in the community now to be engaged in a productive way to address issues that Min had addressed and new ones that have come up since. And so after a long series of meetings and conversations, we came up with Min Yasui Legacy Project with a mission to defend civil rights and advance social justice. That was after hours of conversation, and we came up with this less than 10 words as our mission. But we also came up with a goal statement that would sort of more fully explain what we are about. So the goal is to speak out against injustice in all its forms and develop programs that oppose racism and resist oppression in the context of Japanese American experience and cross-cultural solidarity. We do this work to commemorate and continue the courageous leadership of Minoru Yasui. So we could have taken our effort to a historical direction, or it could have been just a memorial to Min Yasui, um, or many other directions. But it was really important for those of us who sat around the tables to talk about what we needed to do as a follow-up, was that it needed to be about social justice. It needed to be about advocacy. It needed to be about raising our voices and be seen. Min was really a big proponent of speaking up, and he modeled that. And for those of us who grew up without strong role models in the Nikkei community, it was really important to have a Nikkei person who gave us the model of very un-Nikkei approach to things. So that was our inspiration. It's important to us. It was important to us, and it is important to us to have our pride in people who came before us, more than kind, scholarly, properly speaking, mannered person. Someone who touched a much bigger world than most people that we know, and that Min is a important leader, not only for the Nikkei community, but also for all Americans. And that's the light that we want to proceed. Yeah.
Yeah.
So Peggy mentioned the Minoru Yasui Day. That was the first effort after the medal presentation. Some members of our committee approached the legislature and got the Oregon State Legislature to pass a law that proclaimed March 28 as Minoru Yasui Day in perpetuity. It means that Min is the very first person named to have a day dedicated to his memory in Oregon. In addition, he's the very first Oregonian to have received the Presidential Medal of Freedom. So we should all be proud of that. And so since 2016, we've had a Minoru Yasui Day celebration. First 2 or 3 were about replicating the walk that he did in challenging curfew in 1942. But this year, we started to work on a little more substantive, content-oriented gathering for Min Yasui Day. But, pandemic came along, and so March 28 event was postponed and now canceled, and we will regroup for next year's Min Yasui Day on March 2021. We also have Min Yasui's birthday in October as a possible marker for another different kind of smaller event, maybe something that would be a warm-up session towards Min Yasui Day 2021. So that's where we are. We are evolving. We are growing in our understanding of what's possible. And we're very busy participating in these video conferences, because even next year, it is likely to be a remote convening rather than a live gathering. So I'll stop there, and hopefully we will have more conversations about ways in which all the different people can be a participant in not only Min Yasui Day in Oregon, but also in all parts of the country.
Yeah, I think that's I'd love to come back to that question maybe towards the end, as someone who doesn't live in Oregon, to think about how we can, extend that beyond.
Yeah.
But I'm wondering, and maybe this is a question maybe for all three of you. You talked about building this coalition and these kind of cross-community solidarities in order to advance this and ultimately get this Presidential Medal of Freedom for men. And I'm wondering how you did that and what stories you told and what the outreach looked like. I know you said, June, it was a lot of work, but as you know, that work seems really important and you all seem to have been very successful at it. So I'm wondering what kind of strategies or advice or stories you can share, you know, for those of us trying to do that sort of work today, maybe with a different goal, but a sort of similar ethos.
Well, I can start, and then Holly had a lot of contacts in Denver because she grew up there, and then spent a lot of his life there. So what we tried to do was we had a committee in Oregon, we had a consultant in DC, and we had other people in other parts of the country that were helpful. So Denver clearly was a really helpful situation. But when we first started, I asked my contacts in DC, how do we go about doing this? Because I had no idea. And they essentially said, you have to educate the country about who Min Yasui is, because they might know Korematsu, but Min's story was not really told over the decades. So there was that, but there was also this sense that for a Presidential Medal of Freedom, there's no criteria. It's the president decides. And there's this kind of unwritten criteria, however, that the Asian community needs to galvanize around one candidate. Because if there's a sense of, two candidates or something, they're not quite sure what to do with that, and they might just drop each candidate. So we had to get the Asian congressional delegation supporting this. We had Mazie Hirono, Senator Hirono, take the nomination to the White House. So she was the highest ranking Asian politician. And then we just started to say, where are our contacts locally, regionally, and nationally? And I think I used every chit I ever had in Washington, D.C. to get as many national organizations to write letters of support and sign on to it. And we also did things like we drafted shell letters. We researched organizations and thought about how they could speak about the nomination. So we did that. June knew every organization in Oregon, which I didn't know. Holly knew Denver, and she also knew June Burke. She mentioned her before in California, and June was instrumental. And then June had a daughter in Illinois, who then we got a resolution from the Illinois State Legislature to nominate Min Yasui, and off it went. And Holly just kept using her contacts about in Utah, in New Mexico, in all these different places, California. And so we use our contacts all over. So to answer your question, Holly might have more to say.
Thank you.
The other thing that's important to remember is that a task like the medal nomination can't just be whipped up together quickly.
Right.
What it required was sort of the cumulative collection of contacts and knowledge and skills that each of us on the committee brought to the table. And so we relied on everybody taking a group of contacts that we had personal a relationship with and follow through. So there were very few, I think, where we were making cold contacts. And so it's important for us to, when we do undertake a project of importance, that we make sure we know where we've been and what we can call on to help us do this. We can't ignore our collective life experiences. Those are important part of an important undertaking. That's why it's important to have pilgrimages like what you're doing all summer this year, because everybody who's attending, they are accumulating a bit more understanding, knowledge, and making contacts with people they have not known before. And who knows, some of those contacts are going to be really important sometime in the future.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it's important to pay attention when we attend these things.
It's true. It's an active community building.
Yeah.
I'd like to mention that Min Yasui himself was one of the things he really excelled at was networking. I remember as a kid driving all over the country every summer in our Plymouth station wagon. We had 48 stickers of different states.
Wow.
And my dad was, and I just thought we were on summer vacation. I was just a kid, but he was going around and talking to every Japanese American community in Nebraska, in Alabama, in Massachusetts, and as well as the West Coast, Illinois, etc. So I think that was also the fact that we did this project in 2015, and many of his contacts were already passed on, but some people were still around. In particular, I want to mention in Denver that, and from a very early period, my dad was involved. He helped to found the Urban League in Denver, which of course is a African American organization. An organization called Latin American Research and Service Agency. Their name was La Raza, but it's not the La Raza, a very radical one. It was an organization that later changed its name. Also, Denver Native American United. He was himself very much involved with a lot of community organizations, different groups, Catholic groups, Jewish groups, Buddhist groups as well. And then also, there were still people around in New Mexico, Albuquerque, New Mexico, who had worked with him during the redress period. Salt Lake City, Chicago, Yoshino, who was very young at the time, but is still around working on ACL projects there. So I think that Min Yasui himself was a real exemplar of networking, of basically contacting, reaching out across ethnic and racial lines, as well as doing the hard physical work of physically going around the country, meeting and talking to and being with people all over, and communities large and small throughout the country. And that's sort of what we replicated in this kind of smaller way. But as June said, I agree too. It's really important that all these projects that we've done, like my film, he says, you have to tell them how you made the film and you weren't really a filmmaker. I had people who really helped. I had a wonderful co-director that Peggy actually introduced me to. I had a great composer, Soji Kameda, who did the music, Janice Tanaka, who also did shoots. So all of our work, the important part of the collaboration in our work is almost as important as the work itself, because it is by teaming up and working with other people that we can really accomplish much more than any individual can. But as a community, we are and can be strong and stronger.
And let me just add that George Takei.
Oh, George, of course, I forgot to mention George. I should tell that little story because people might be interested to know that George Takei was a young actor in Star Trek when he went to Japan with Min Yasui in 1970. Wow. And here's this, 50-plus old guy and young George Takei, and they were roommates at Sophia University. They had a summer course in Japan, and they became really, really good friends. And I know they went out. My mother and us kids were not there. They went out drinking, carousing. So George, when I kind of hesitant to ask him when I was tasked with getting a narrator for the film, and I don't remember if you with Peggy, but he says, "Well, we'll ask George Takei." And so I wrote him this letter and kind of hesitant. I never met him personally, and he said, I would move heaven and earth to pay homage, to pay tribute to Min Yasui, because he was such an important influence in George's life as an activist, but also as a friend. So yeah, George is a really important. I can't believe I forgot to mention that, but he was really an incredibly important collaborator in that project.
And the other thing I want to say, along with George, who wrote a letter of support for the nomination, is that we got letters of support from the African American, Latino, Native American, Jewish community. And I think we did the Presidential Medal of Freedom campaign like in the spirit of Min's life, grassroots, a lot of contacts, a lot of networking, and bringing it all together. So I'm really happy about the way that it came about and the way that we did it, as well as definitely happy about the outcome.
The process, yeah.
Right.
Well, I want to add to Peggy and Holly's comments about the broad range of people that were involved. When Peggy mentions her contact in Washington, D.C. And Hawaii and so on and so forth, what was amazing realization for me was to see how many Asian Americans, not just Japanese Americans, but Asians of all spectrum of ethnic backgrounds are in very important places in our government, either as private consultants or as government employees or political appointees. And Peggy in particular was really instrumental in sort of drawing on those people where they are and finding out how they can guide us and giving us tips when we were not sure how we're going to get to where we wanted to be. And so that was another source of great sense of pride for me, in that there were all these people in very responsible positions all across the country at the head of our government, capital, and so on and so forth. And that really was an eye opener for me. So we didn't have to think of ourselves as isolated, small group of people trying to appeal to the white leadership.
Right. Right. That's important. Yeah. And Holly, you mentioned this a little bit when you were talking about your experience making the film, but that Min's, standing up and speaking out and getting arrested and protesting was all sort of before what we think of as the civil rights era. So I'm wondering how you see Min was influenced by the civil rights era, how that shaped his work, even, years after he had begun his own activism and sort of become a leader and an activist in his own right. How was he sort of shaped and his work shaped by the civil rights movement?
By the time the civil rights movement got into full steam, my father was a mature adult. He was in his, that would be like the 60s, so he would have been in his 50s. He was the executive director of the Commission on Community Relations, and he was in fact involved with keeping the temperatures down in manifestations in what's the word? I'm sorry, that's a word in Spanish. In riots and activities that were going on in Denver, and in fact, some people have credited him with the fact that there were not big blowups in Colorado, which has a very large population of Latinos, and about the country's average of African Americans. Whereas, of course, in many other cities, there was a lot of protest activity. And I do remember my dad going out every night. Not only did he work in the office during the day, but he'd go out at night to attend community meetings. He was, in many ways, interestingly enough, part of the establishment because he worked for the city and county of Denver. He was a government official. He was also an ex-con, which he always liked to remind people. He had, he spent his 9 months in jail, and was actually convicted of. It was actually a misdemeanor, but he was a ex-con. So I think that. That was more of a continuation or of extension of the work that he really had already started in the 50s. But the 60s for him were somewhat of a culmination, and he was an older man by then. He was a person, and he was part of the establishment. Before that, he was a self-employed attorney. But starting in the early 1960s, my mother insisted that he get a real job, because when he was a self-employed attorney, he never made any money, because nobody had money, because all the Japanese Americans, of course, had had everything taken away from him, and his other clients were Black and Latino people who didn't have any money. But they gave us things. They gave us comic books and produce from their farms, big turkey we had one year. But at any rate, so my father had already been, involved with that sort of, he was already involved in that way with civil rights. So by the time that he was, involved in the civil rights movement in the 60s, was from a different perspective than as a young man. Of course, when he was in his 20s, he was on the other side. He was, of course, challenging the U.S. government at that time. And by the time he was in his 50s, he was actually a city official. But I do think that his work helped to keep the lid on Denver. The unrest that happened all throughout the country had a lot to do with him and his staff. And likewise, he had this incredible staff, very diverse. African American, Latino, Native American women. And I think that the fact that his staff also went out there, they went out to the meetings at night. They weren't, just sitting in their office talking about justice and the demands that people were making. They went out to the meetings at night. One night he actually came back with a cut on his head because somebody threw a rock at him or something. Yeah. So they were actually out there, participating in the activities of the civil rights movement.
And Erin, can I add that when Yasui was the first Japanese American member of the Oregon State Bar, and he was 25 at the time of the curfew. So if you can imagine yourself being 25 years old, the only Japanese American member of a bar association, and you decide, I'm going to be my own test case because I believe in this country and the court system and the Constitution and justice so much. Yeah. I'm such a patriot that my rights will be vindicated. And I've asked this question of audiences through the decades, especially lawyer audiences. Would you have the guts and the courage to do that, to test the constitutionality, to believe in the court system that much that you would intentionally violate a law and get yourself arrested? And in many audiences, there would be one person, usually a white male in the back of the room, saying, I would do that. Okay, yeah, sure. All right. But really, I don't know if I would have done that. So talk about an act of selfless heroism.
Yeah, and I think one of the parts of your film, Holly, that really struck me was talking about right after Min was arrested and he called his mom.
And a nice story.
I think of just, yes, this incredibly selfless and brave act and this real belief in the promise of what America could be. But then also his family there, to say we trust that you're doing what's right and we're behind you. And I think I see that so much also in how you're talking about collaborating and building community to keep his legacy alive, is that sense of family and that sense of community. And that, yes, it could be one person out front, but there's got to be this whole, team in the background supporting. That's just powerful. And I think says a lot about Min, but also a lot about your family and this community and you, Peggy and June, for being sort of drawn to this work and to this person and to this project. That's really, it's beautiful. It's inspiring to see. Peggy, I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more about the case itself and your work on the case, on Min's court case, and some of the challenges that were, part of that work, especially being only 5 years out of law school, which is really impressive to me.
Well, I'd never heard of Coram Nobis before we filed before it was brought up. But there were a team of lawyers from California, Oregon, and Washington. And we worked on this together because we had Peter Irons had found evidence, and Aiko Hirschnaga also did as well, evidence in the National Archives that the incarceration was not based on military necessity, but based on race. And that's just a huge eye opener. 120,000 people were incarcerated because of their race. That's a very different story than it's because of military necessity. So finding those documents was just incredible, to talk about a smoking gun. But the cases themselves, we created these petitions that were almost identical from state to state to state. And we decided to start in California because we figured that we would get the best bench was in Northern California. And so Dale Minami, when he contacted me and when we talked about this, said, well, really what we're going to do is file a motion for consolidation. You'll only have to deal with this case for about 6 months, Peggy, and then it'll come down to California and we'll take over because we've got this huge resource of attorneys. Well, they filed that motion. It was denied. So it meant that in Oregon, I was going to get a group of lawyers together, very diverse group of lawyers together, and go through all the documents. And every brief, because there was no precedent for this, really, every brief we wrote was, what do we need to say in this brief because it might be the last brief that we write. Yeah. So we got to put everything in it. And so there was that aspect of it. There was the attorney for the government, Victor Stone, who was the attorney for all 3 cases. I don't think he was doing his job because his job is about seeking justice, not about winning a case. But that's where he was headed. And then we had a judge named Judge Bologna. And that was also a little challenging because I don't think that he understood the magnitude of what we were saying. And so he said, well, the government is okay about vacating the conviction, about getting rid of the conviction, and that's what you want to. And there's no use in having this evidentiary hearing from 40 years ago. It's not relevant, blah, blah, blah. So he vacated the judgment. He vacated the conviction, but he didn't allow us to have an evidentiary hearing. And our case went on, and actually in the middle of it, then Min passed away. But I feel like we got our time in court through the Hirabayashi case that went to a trial. And the government attorney, Edward Innes, who wrote the briefs in World War II to the U.S. Supreme Court, testified on our behalf. And said that the government in 43 lied to the Supreme Court. We had evidence, exculpatory evidence, that and it was tantamount to a suppression of evidence that is what happened. And so to hear the lawyer who wrote these briefs finally vindicate Japanese Americans was quite something. On the other hand, Victor Stone was arguing like Pearl Harbor happened last week. So it was just a really juxtaposition of it. But I feel that in Hirabayashi, we got what we wanted, which was them to admit that it was not based on race. It was not based on military necessity. It was based on race. So, and then we kept on doing things. We kept on doing amicus briefs, and we kept on throughout the decades, now representing the children like Holly and Karen Korematsu and Jay Hirabayashi. Up until the travel ban cases, we filed amicus briefs in the travel ban, Trump's travel ban cases. So who would have thought in 1982 that we would be going on, but we have been.
Yeah, a little longer than 6 months, I would say.
Yeah.
That's awesome. Yeah, that's great. And actually, another one of the films from this week for the pilgrimage, Alternative Facts, which is John Osaki's film, does a really good job also of going through this history in a way that was, I mean, I've read so much about this and still continue to learn about how these court cases worked and how these legacies continue. And yeah, it's wonderful. Well, thank you for, for all of the work you continue to do.
We do have a question from Victor Yamada, who says, Holly, thanks for bringing the draft film version to New Mexico. Were you aware before of Min's New Mexico visit? I guess you connected with folks in New Mexico who met Min during his redress support visit.
I knew because Nikki Lewis told me about the Day of Remembrance event that was some years ago, and I'm blanking on his name, Randy Shibata, who was with the JCL, New Mexico JCL, made an incredible presentation about how Min Yasui went to one of their events. Peter Dominici, who's an extremely conservative Republican senator at that time, was at that same event, and how Min Yasui made the speech that just blew everybody away, frankly. And Pete Dominici took his speech he had written out, and he just put it aside and said, Min, after hearing what you have to say, your love for the United States, what happened to your family, he says, I'm with you. I will support redress. Wow. And so I really think, and Randy said that was really a turning point in the whole redress movement, because Dominici was a very important Republican senator, and to pass Congress, you have to have bipartisan support. Right. And it is extraordinary, and that's another example of the kind of networking and collaboration that's necessary, because Japanese Americans is just a small percentage of the whole population. We did have Inouye and FARC, and what's the other one in California? We had some Nikkei legislators, but that wasn't enough. It was really the fact that many other legislators came over to our side. So the answer to your question, Victor, is I knew not at the time. That time when my dad was running around doing redress, I was up at University of Wisconsin doing Marxism. And so we were not on the same wavelength exactly, my father and I. We kept in touch. He sent me these itineraries every week that said where he was going, like hundreds of different places. I really just couldn't keep up. I mean, not even with a letter. I know he was in New Mexico. I don't remember. He didn't tell me about that particular event in New Mexico, but Nikki told me, and I was very, very grateful to get a video of Randy Shibata, who unfortunately died only a couple years after he made that speech. So I am aware of the fact that he traveled a lot in his tri-state area. He was the district governor of ACL. He traveled a lot to New Mexico, the states, New Mexico, Arizona, Colorado, Utah, Wyoming. But that particular visit, I learned about that from Randy, basically.
Yeah, and I know we're almost at time, and I want to ask one question of my own before we end. But we have a question from David Fuji about campaign for the Medal of Freedom if you would have had to deal with our current life.
Well, I know we intentionally said that we need to get this done in 2015. And we set about doing that so we would ensure that we would get it done in 2015. And that may be the answer to the question.
Right. It's a hypothetical that we don't have to, yeah. That's great. Well, thank you all so much. I do want to just, ask about next steps, the work that you all are continuing to do. But those of us, as we talked about June, when you were sharing about Min Yasui Day, what can we be doing to continue in ways, however small, Min's legacy, especially right now. And it seems like there are so many ways that so many places that we need to speak up and help and do the kind of work that you all have done and are continuing to do. What advice or steps are you taking?
Well, Let me start. I think it's really so important for everybody who cares about our civil liberties and social justice to be involved at the local as well as national level. At a minimum, you need to know what's going on. And one of the things that I just read today is that four congressional representatives from California is drafting a letter to send to Attorney General Barr to condemn the anti-Asian hate crimes and bias related to the COVID-19 being referred to as Hunan virus, China, let's see, um, Wuhan virus, Kung flu, and Chinese virus. And our president keeps using those terminology, and others are beginning to use it too. So anyway, these Congress representatives have prepared a letter, and they need co-sponsors from representatives all over the country. And so each of us need to contact our own congressional representative and get them to sign on to this letter. It needs to be done before July 3rd, so you have about a week. So do that. Just an email or a phone call is what's needed from everybody. And if there's a huge pouring of requests like that, I think would make a big difference. Yeah, so things like that. In each city also, it would be really good for the people out in the audience to get their city councils or county supervisors to pass resolutions condemning hate crimes based on stereotypes and scapegoating around COVID-19. In Portland, we've had at least 10 formally submitted complaints about hate crimes against Asian Americans related to COVID-19. And there are high school students who are being attacked verbally and otherwise around the same thing. So it's pretty widespread. So we should all get on that.
Are we over our time?
Well, we have a couple more minutes. I'd love to hear from you, Peggy and Holly, too, before we sign off.
Oh, Holly, go ahead.
Okay, I'd like to just give a shout out to Zuru for Solidarity, which I think is one of the most important nationwide organizations of Japanese American activists. Check out the webpage, zuruforsolidarity.org. Lots of activities going on. You can support lots of good connections that you can make.
And lastly, I would say, Erin, that we can do something in almost every conversation. So in almost every conversation, we're pushing forward social justice, we're neutral, or we're not saying anything. And I think it's so important for each of us to speak up where we can. And usually it's in those one-to-one conversations. But to have the courage to do that. And you don't have to, there's no perfect way to do it, but there's a way to disrupt the conversation, and that to realize that silence is being complicit. And that anti-Black racism now is really important for Asians to stand together with our Black allies and with our Latino allies to make sure that people understand, as Asian Americans, we're not almost white. We're not the model minority. We're not the yellow peril. We are and will stand for justice and social justice.
Well, thank you so much. I think that's the perfect place to end on. Thank you so much, all three of you, for being here and giving time and sharing your thoughts and your stories. It's so appreciated. I'll encourage everyone to please check out Holly's film if you haven't seen it yet, Never Give Up, and the educational resources that are also tied to it and linked on the JAMP website as well. So thank you so much. I'll hope to talk with you all again soon, but take care.
Thank you, Erin. You've been great.